We have the support this evening from In Our Name Initiative and Gordon and Sharon Boyd, and we thank them very much for enabling this program to take place. Caffe Lena's Community Classroom Series is a chance to learn about civic issues from people with hands-on experience and those impacted directly by the topic. These conversations are rooted in real-world experience. These conversations are compassionate, and they are intended to honor the forgotten and suffering among us. Caffe Lena hosts this project because our venue is known for folk songs. And folk songs have always taken the side of the underdog, the outsider, the poor, the forgotten. These are conversations that give us a chance to learn more about the people that we are singing about. Tonight, we're going to look at how our nation is responding to a growing mental health crisis. We are all aware that if we have a family member in crisis, a friend in crisis, 911 is the number that we dial. And who shows up? The police show up. And sometimes families don't get the help that they were hoping for. Sometimes those visits end in tragedy. And all too often, they result in a mentally ill person being incarcerated. And treatment when they get to jail or when they get to prison is completely unacceptable. And we are going to be learning a lot more about that this evening. This discussion is going to last about an hour. It will be moderated by Gordon Boyd. Gordon is currently the president of Mercy House here in Saratoga Springs. This is a new housing option associated with Bethesda Episcopal Church for individuals with disabilities and other housing challenges. He previously served for 7 years as a religious volunteer at Mount McGregor Correctional Facility in nearby Wilton, New York. And while he was there, he prepared men for parole and release. And he also did a lot to bring music and art into the facility. Gordon also has a background in journalism and public policy, and he's just a wonderful addition to this panel. And we thank him very much for giving us his time this evening. Mary Buser is the author of the award-winning book, Lockdown on Rikers, Shocking Stories of Abuse and Injustice at New York's Notorious Jail. It's an incredible honor to have you with us, Mary. Thank you for your time tonight. She spent time at Rikers dealing with prisoners who were put in a psychiatric unit and seeing the way that treatment was meted out in that facility. And she'll have a lot to say about that. And Reverend Michael D. Bell is a native of Buffalo, New York, but he is a pastor here in Saratoga Springs. He has been part of this community classroom series with other topics as well, but he's a pastor, a community organizer, an activist, and he has been involved with the Poor People's Campaign in our region. So Reverend Bell, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. And Gordon, I'm going to turn it over to you now to get the conversation flowing.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and welcome everyone in the audience to this community classroom. It is a very timely and pertinent topic. It seems that every few weeks there's a law enforcement event that challenges people's judgment and sense of justice. And I think this discussion tonight will help to bring that into the foreground from a couple of learned individuals, Mary Buser and Reverend Michael Bell from our own community. In my multifaceted background, I worked for the Speaker of the Assembly for 13 years at the state legislature, and during that time, there were maybe at the beginning of my time there were probably 35,000 people in the state correctional system, and by the end of that time, there were probably over 60,000, and eventually got to 70,000. Now it's back down in the 30s again. Also during that time, while I was working for the Speaker of the Assembly, the decisions were made to close down the large institutions that served the people with mental illness and developmental disabilities. And this was an extremely controversial period when people whose careers and jobs depended on those facilities were, their lives changed significantly. New facilities had to be developed to absorb that population and to treat them continually, but an awful lot of them ended up going into the correctional system, which contributed to the increase in population in the correctional system. So although I wasn't involved in the policies that resulted in that situation, I did observe it close up and the political impact of it on the leadership of the state legislature. So it's with that on the record, I thought I would turn first to Mary, and Mary, ask you to give us some historical context. I mean, I've talked about maybe the last 35 or 40 years, but I think there's really centuries of care and treatment and mistreatment of people with mental health and other disabilities that feed into the situation that we find ourselves in, and that's the subject of your very well-regarded book, which I just obtained today, and I haven't finished it yet. But I wonder if you could give us a sketch or a little discourse on how we got here over the centuries of Western civilization.
Yes. Well, thank you, Gordon. Thank you. And a thank you to Caffe, Lena, for sponsoring this very important event. I'm very honored to be a panelist here along with Reverend Bell. So yes, if we look at it, and I think it's very important to see where we're coming from. And when we look at the people with severe and persistent mental illness, we're primarily talking about people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and recognizable to a lot of us as those homeless people who are disheveled, standing on the corners, etc. And I think we have to take a moment just to understand just what tragic figures they are, the suffering that they endure, simply trying to organize their own brains. They deserve our compassion, our support, and more than kindness. We have to do better than we're doing. And their history has been a very cruel one to begin with. If we go back to several centuries ago to Bedlam, people were chained to walls. They were denied heat in the wintertime. It was thought that people with mental illness were impervious to temperature changes. Many were considered to be possessed, so exorcisms followed, all kinds of horrible rituals to try and rid people of, quote, demons. But perhaps really awful is the fact that Bedlam became a tourist attraction. People would come in for entertainment to gawk at these poor souls. So this was really beyond a low point in the treatment of, or care, the word is not care, of people with mental illness. Now, if we fast forward to the United States prior to the Civil War, a woman named Barthia Dix was a Sunday school teacher at a jail in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she observed people chained to the walls and enduring these horrific circumstances. She was absolutely appalled by what she saw, and she made it her life's work to bring some compassion and humane treatment to these poor people. And she went before Congress, she lobbied, she was a force, and she succeeded. She opened a big institution in Mississippi with the idea of nature being very much part of the architecture, open spaces, people treated very kindly, get rid of the criminalization, just allow people to live here. And the idea took off in a big way, and similar facilities opened up through the South. And after the Civil War, they were absolutely inundated with people who had been traumatized by the war. And tragically, again, and this is pointing to racial issues, for Black residents of these institutions, they were segregated. And it's documented that they often did not have mattresses and died at twice the rate of white residents. So we see the history of coming right out of the Civil War of this treatment of people of color. Anyway, overall, her mission was noble and she was trying. And again, these things started sprouting up all over. The biggest one in New York State, Long Island, Pilgrim State, housed 13,000 people. And during this time, doctors were performing experiments on people. And a lot of them were, when we look back now, horrible things to look back upon. Ice cube therapy, fever therapy, and most recognizable to us would be lobotomies that were taking place in these institutions. And at the time, many of these doctors were well-intentioned, but there was very little understanding of what caused mental illness. So as we move through the decades, the public was starting to get concerned about what was going on, no transparency. These institutions and state hospitals were very cut off. It was very easy for people to be committed. All you had to do was basically bring your wife in, and people had no rights. They could easily be committed to these places. And journalists started making their way in and found that in many ways, over time, these hospitals, in many cases, had devolved into just snake pits, where it was barely any difference between the bedlam that we saw centuries ago. And then there was a move to shut them down, deinstitutionalize, bring people out. And in 1963, President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act. The idea behind it being to create community resources to treat people in the community, get rid of these hospitals. And at that time, in 1950, Thorazine, the first antipsychotic, was introduced. So the hope was that between these emerging antipsychotic drugs and community treatment, that this was the big answer. Tragically, much of this community supervision, housing, never came to pass for a variety of reasons. It was funding, it was also NIMBY, it was also people who were not as severely afflicted were housed there. It just never was well organized, and consequently, people started to become homeless without any support, spiraling down and getting into trouble with the police. Now, the nail in the coffin for community support came with President Reagan, who money earmarked for it and switched it to a block grant to states, which enabled states that did not want to invest in this could invest the money however they chose. This coincided with the war on drugs, and lo and behold, the states took that money and built prisons. And the big prison buildup was underway, and with people with mental illness spiraling down, getting in trouble with the police, usually, but not always, but usually for petty things like loitering, would be arrested and brought to jails and prisons. And at this juncture right now, currently there's roughly 3,217 public beds for people with mental illness, while in New York State, the number of incarcerated people with a mental illness is close to 14,000 people. So jails and prisons are the new institutions. There's no question about it. They have been re-institutionalized, but now in a penal setting. And that brings it to me and my work there, where I was called to the receiving room every day, where the newly arrested were brought in to evaluate people who presented with a mental illness. And I just remember standing there asking myself, was it what happened? All the hospitals emptied out for something so much better. And my God, here we are now, Rikers Island. This is where we are treating people with mental illness. And this is where we are today.
So let me just recap the data that you offered there. There are about 3,000 beds. Is that statewide or citywide?
Statewide.
Statewide for people with mental illness, and that's outside of the correctional system.
Correct.
And 14,000 beds inside the correctional system for prisoners that are judged to be mentally ill. Is
Correct.
that about right?
Yes, that's the new, whether you would address it as such, the new treatment facilities now are jails and prisons.
And are the 3,000 outside of the correctional system, are they in community residences, or are they under some other type of state control?
They are under state control. It's very limited. There's nothing near the need. Very, very, very little. It's very hard to get anyone into anything like that.
So what we know to be the community residence option that might be operated by a local nonprofit like RISE or other local organizations, those data are not in these numbers here.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Just to make sure we're not getting the venues mixed up with each other in terms of policy options. Reverend Bell, it's so good to be with you, even virtually. And as we were talking about this program this afternoon at a sort of a prep session, I really think it would be beneficial if you could sort of take the faith community's perspective on the history that Mary has just offered. I was interested that she mentioned the facility called Bedlam in England, which in my readings is a Anglo contraction of the word Bethlehem. And so it actually has a biblical scriptural origin, although I would say misbegotten in terms of the actual operations there. It was, and it also became an expression of generalized chaos and dysfunction, as a generic term. But perhaps the reading of Matthew 25 and the actions of the faith community, have been sitting on the sidelines or involved in ways that haven't had the impact that we would have desired from the scene that Mary has painted.
First of all, I want to thank Mary Busey for her contributions that she's making to this conversation and the larger conversation. That has been very needful to go into. I perhaps just to fill in a bit. Back in college, I served as president of prison ministries and served in parishes or pastorates that in communities, in two major communities, one in Auburn and one in Elmira, that all had maximum security prisons. And so doing ministry in those areas had been fundamental to my development. As a social activist, particularly working with the recent resurrected Poor People's Campaign, I helped organize a region down in the eastern southern tier, and now in the northern country, as we call it. We're involved with lots of work. I certainly sit to write policy, political education work with a team of us for New York State. So to answer your question, from the religious community, particularly from within the Black church, I I'm amazed that the Fugitive Slave Law Act of 1850 that was signed by Millard Fillmore, president, that was lifted up out of Buffalo, New York, September 29th or 28th, 1850, begins a lot of the work that we as the religious community are working at and working on, along with other partners, to minimize and reduce the dependency of jails and prisons in this country, for one big reason, if any other, that the net result or net impact has not been more promising to the human community. Certainly, there's too much detriment that goes on within the individuals once they get incarcerated. The damage to the family, the mere fact that it really hasn't solved any major problem, doesn't stop crime, and I could give you a whole list of other things. And so these are conversations that we're constantly having, even to the point where we get this to the state. My issue, primarily from the mental health perspective, is that when they drop the ball, the states drop the ball on prisoners with mental health. Certainly back in 1996, there was a case, pretty much a landmark case, that made it possible to remind those that have been institutionalized that the deliberate indifference of the institution toward those that needed medical attention inside, health and otherwise, those would be penalized because of particular writings within the Eighth Amendment. So it becomes imperative for us to realize the power that states and federal governments have in righting wrongs. So whether we're talking about the Fugitive Slave Law Act and how police were actually coming after those of African descent, or how they, as Mary had pointed out, had captured, taken in, incarcerated those which later became the eugenics movement. Much of that was controlled out of New York State, that had its hub in the lower parts of the state. And so I find that as a religious community, we have so much to deal with, from the prison pipeline in our school systems to the warrior methodology that was embraced near the end of the Reagan administration, and through the rise of incarceration all over this country, which really left a big hole in the pocket of the American citizen, because we wound up paying a tremendous amount. And when you get that shift of funding that used to go to those who had mental emotional infirmities, big question that you have to ask is, where's the beef? Where did the money go? And when you find out it was a scheme by our elected officials to move that money into jails and prisons, and whether you realize it or not, we did not pay on the military budget nowhere near what we're paying. We're now at 56 cents on a dollar in every community, and that's an atrocity. And so when we have created a policing force that represented warriors instead of guardians, when we have fed the beast and created prisons, privatized prisons, and made this a matter of profit and not a matter of dealing with fragmented community, we wound up getting in more trouble. And so right now, the faith community has its hands in all areas as it relates to incarceration, whether it is on the healthcare side, the policy side, working with social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, other clergy, community members, even to the point where we really have to do a lot with families that come in and are part of the criminal justice system just because of a loved one that is now incarcerated and the stress that it puts on those families. Maybe not so much in New York State, but certainly in other places, particularly those of the southern states. I still call those Confederate states, but those are the southern states. And we have fragmentation as we understand what it means to be equally protected under the law. So having said that, our hands, Gordon, are just full of, I mean, we used to send cookies to the inmates and Christmas cards. I mean, there's so many little avenues that religion can take on to make that part more bearable, more tolerable. And if I understood Jesus when he sort of accepted his call, but he opens up a scroll, and that scroll had come from Isaiah 61. And the first thing he says is that the anointing of God is upon me, and he had come to set captives free. And so that becomes a very visual response to the brokenness of our political and economic systems worldwide. This is not just an American problem. This is a global problem. And it's a problem particularly where we have such wealth accumulation, which is a dominant thing here in the United States. And we can do better. We can do better. I like what Sarah Craig from Caffe Lena said when she talked about how important social is. And for those that are now incarcerated, the abuse is that we take them to a point of essentially dehumanizing them. And so what she had said was social is essentially a human activity. So from the time that I look at, since we were talking about the Civil War and Andersonville, Georgia, which housed the worst prison this country ever produced, all the way into Elmira, which was a northern prison, neither one of them ever talked about the humanity of those that it incarcerated, regardless, black, white, red, or yellow. And in spite of the fact that, I often tell, particularly in the Black communities and Black churches, I particularly have conversations about with the mothers and fathers who are very concerned about the police brutality and the policing issue and the actual fear that their children are going to be incarcerated and put into a sentence of death, which is it's even worse when you begin to look at the stigma that it places on families who have had people and loved ones in their family incarcerated. And so there's so many different psycho and social levels to talk about.
Excuse me, let me thank you very much. That was a very complete answer to my question and more. Let me redirect a couple of questions here that are coming in from the audience, and we encourage those in the viewing public to post questions on the YouTube side of the screen, and or on the side of the YouTube screen, but I'll just start and direct them as seems logical. Mary, what effect did privatized prisons have, if any, in New York State? And did Rockefeller drug laws play a role in the need for what we now would define as a restorative justice program? How do we balance out the future against the history?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that there are privatized prisons in New York State. I don't think that New York contracts for any privatized. Yeah.
I agree. I think that's true.
Yeah. The second question, I'm not quite clear. You mentioned the Rockefeller drug laws and
the question is phrased, did the Rockefeller drug laws play a role in the need for a restorative justice program? And I'm rephrasing it. to say, well, we had the Rockefeller drug laws. We've now let a lot of those people out, or they've maxed out. And what do we do to make up? I mean, there's a lot of talk about reparations in connection with slavery. Well, the Rockefeller drug laws gathered up the type A male leaders of many communities, and especially minority communities in New York State, and locked them up for many, many years for nonviolent drug offenses. Now they're back with their families and their communities. What's the agenda for making up for that injustice, I think, is the intent of the questioner.
Well, I mean, the Rockefeller drug laws were just horrendous. That's what really built up the prison population in New York State. And thank God they were finally reformed, but not after a tremendous amount of suffering occurred. In terms of restorative justice, it is a very wonderful and hopeful concept. It is in its, I don't want to say it's in its infancy. It's in terms of it's getting a lot of traction, but it has not yet really translated into anything solid yet. But I'm hopeful that it's coming for sure. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, I agree with that last statement, and I think it is definitely getting traction as a advocacy agenda item. Hasn't really been institutionalized yet in terms of becoming a funded state program with some durability. There's no committee in the legislature on restorative justice. There's just the Judiciary Committee or the Criminal Justice Committee, Crime and Corrections, whatever. So a question for both of our experts. We know that dialing 911 can produce disastrous and uncertain results for a mentally ill person. What should ordinary folks do to get help in a crisis? Reverend Bell?
I want to go back first to that last question that you asked Mary.
Sure.
Under the Obama administration, one of the things that he was able to do across the board was to take a look at non-violent felons. We often take a look at violent felons and non-violent felons. And so you saw a relaxing even of the Rockefeller laws in New York State because, number one, the cost, if the actual cost, when you start taking a look at, the cost of incarceration, we're looking at $300 billion in the United States. But when you add in there all the other ancillary costs and the costs on the family, et cetera, you're looking over $1.2 trillion. And somewhere between the excessive cost of funding and the mere fact that across this country, we had to start lessening our responsiveness to fund prisons. And so we needed to cut back on those numbers. Cutting back on those numbers is what we were beginning to achieve through programs that allowed for nonviolent offenders to be deinstitutionalized. As far as 911 is concerned, there's a case that happened in Rochester, New York, Daniel Prude, where 911 would not have mattered. There was another one in Elmira, New York, with a Gary Strobridge, where an individual was on the house naked, who had a mental infirmity and a meltdown, but 911 actually was the call that sent him to his grave. And so whether a Daniel Prude that was in the street in the middle of February in Rochester, New York, without clothes on from a 911 call or something like that, sending police out who are ill-equipped to deal with the mentally ill really begs the question of whether or not that landmark case in '76 actually has gone far enough, because when you have in these communities where the police are actually getting off, it really has not helped to curb the glut of the justice system sending people into being incarcerated and into the criminal justice system. So the 911 system has to change. I do believe with Executive Order 203 in New York State, you're seeing a lot of the municipalities begin to make some basic shifts of how they respond to these calls out of, with 911, and what should be a mental health call and what should be a true violent call. And that's from conversations that I've had with police chiefs all over the state.
It's a great summary of the difficulty of the situation. Mary, I would toss that question to you, but
Sure.
I'd like to add a little bit to it, and that is that drug addiction, I think we would all agree, is a tremendous problem in communities from one end of the state to the other. I mean, at one point it was heroin, then it was cocaine, crack cocaine. Now we've got opioids and other things. What happens when what happened when you were at Rikers? If someone who had been arrested presents as if they were mentally ill, how do you distinguish that from a reaction to an addictive drug? And how does the professional deal with that dichotomy where the person may not actually be mentally ill, but may be reacting in a disorganized and dysfunctional way to drugs that they have become addicted to?
Yeah. I'd like to answer that. And I'd just like to go back for a moment about the 911 call and say that there are experimental programs right now sending mental health workers with the police to accompany them, to take the lead in speaking to someone who is in an emotional crisis. There's an organization called Cahoots in California, I believe. New York is just starting it. It's promising. I don't know in the end who's going to call the shots, the police or the social worker, but it's an attempt to try to mitigate the horror of these 911 calls and the way that the police respond to them. So we're seeing some movement along those lines. We're also seeing a program in Florida that has been very successful, training police. They're getting very intensive training with how to deal with a person in emotional distress, and they've got a different way of diversion that they're working on down there. So traditionally, calling 911 to have the police come is just a real crapshoot, and hopefully we're going to get some changes there. But it's been a disaster so far.
Are there any, I'm sorry, go on. I was just going to ask if there are any solutions in other countries that we could learn from.
I don't know. Not that I know. There may be, but I don't know. Yeah. Where's that? Oregon?
No, I was going to say in Great Britain,
Okay.
How they police is entirely different. First of all, they don't have the guns on the street that we do. Second of all, not all of the police will carry guns, only special units. And so the response of the various teams of the British police, or bobbies, are entirely different than how we do. In fact, what's ironic is that we get much of our policing, at least the fundamental of a conversation. The Peelian method is supposed to be a British model, but we've been to kind of like Gunsmoke, shoot them up, instead of providing the humanitarian aid that's necessary, or giving a more of a humane approach. And that's the whole issue of the restorative justice side of it, contrary to the Rockefeller side, is that you cannot have a punitive methodology, which really was what our prisons were built on, when there should be a more efforts placed in humanitarian efforts. Fix the broken child. And Frederick Douglass said, it's easier to build up a human being than it is to rebuild a broken one. Now, I use it in the context of gender, but that's where you need specialized care. And we don't have specialized care in there to identify those things. And we must get healthcare professionals in from the jails to the prisons in greater ways than what we have.
Okay.
I
Mary,
agree.
you were going to
And
finish the point. Please do.
Okay, I just want to say, Reverend Bell, I agree with you, but I also think that there has to be a division. Healthcare professionals have to respond to their own code of ethics, and they too quickly, and this is something that I observed in my own work, get kind of drawn into the correctional end of things and doing the bidding of correctional personnel and the police. So it's very important that that humanity piece is essential, and that the helping professions stand strong and separate from the pull to do the bidding of the police. And I don't know if it all makes sense, but I've been involved in some of that because it's tough. But I agree with you. The humanity is absolutely where it's at. So just to go back to your question about someone coming to the jail who presents in a psychotic manner, and you don't know what is going on with that person, because understand, when someone is arrested, they're not arriving with their health chart. You have absolutely nothing to go on. You have a person who is mentally just disoriented and incoherent. They would be at Rikers Island. They would be, if I met that person in that receiving room that I described, I would fill out a form that they do not go to the general population, but to a mental observation unit that at that time was staffed by mental health professionals. The person would then, the psychiatrist would make some preliminary diagnoses, but it would be observed, and you would see if they were starting to improve. You would see, if there were drug issues, they might have to go into detox, etc. But it was very much considered that could be a piece of the way that they were presenting. Yeah.
Great. We have a follow-up question to the 911 question that asks, so how would you answer that question if you needed help tonight? And I think if my sort of naive starting out answer to that is, if I had someone in my household who was having a psychotic episode and needed help, I would probably try to get the ambulance to come and or the emergency room to be available if I were able to bring the person to the emergency room, because I find that the hospitals have social workers as well as medical professionals who are able to identify some remedies and at least immediate treatments that might not involve the point of a gun.
I would agree. Not many options, but that one would be certainly preferable to involving the police.
What rights do incarcerated people have over their treatment? Do they have to take prescribed medications? And what happens to these prescriptions when they are released? Mary?
Well, in New York State, in the jails and prisons, you could not force medication. It would take a court order to force medication. So if we go back to the example of a person coming in who was psychotic and to our mental observation unit, they might be prescribed medication, and if they took it, usually they did. Usually they would agree to take it, but if they did not, they could not be forced to take it. You would have to wait. Oftentimes people who are psychotic will cycle in and out. So you would wait until they would cycle to a place that they might be able to connect with you, and you could talk to them about taking a medication. But most people would take it. And then if people absolutely refused, you would send them out to like Bellevue, but even Bellevue could not force it, but just an attempt to maybe a change of scenery or something that a person might be inclined to take the medication. And I have to say, I mean, since I left Rikers, I have done a lot of advocacy work, and I've spoken with clinicians from other states where things are forced and awful things happen, and it's appalling. That was not my experience on Rikers. We were well intended. And I did find that people who could be just come in so gone, and in a matter of maybe 10 days or so would sit on the side of their cot like newly awakened as they came back together. So we did restore and help people. Now, they didn't always want to keep taking the medication. They would, refuse. That's a whole other issue. But we did not, we couldn't legally force meds. And certainly when a person became lucid, there was much more conversation with them about what they had and what might help them and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But that's not true for every state. No.
What I've seen in some areas is that there are some areas that are bringing on cahoots in order to be the default in the 911 system. That if it is not a critical matter, that falls under a certain category, but if it's a mental health call, then the call would be transferred immediately to them. On the other hand, I've seen other areas which have used a modified version of that, which will have a social worker and a police officer in the car. 30 years ago, we wound up putting clergy in the cars with police officers in order to mitigate the emotional trauma when we've had murder victims. And so we just built on to that in order to make sure that we had a better response team there to provide the kind of emotional benefits that those families may have needed one way or the other. Then I've seen other groups that just totally ignore it and send the police officers that are ill-equipped, ill-trained, not trained, and then the responsibility falls on a I don't know what they call, I forgot what they call it, a first line police officer that has responsibility for maintaining that line of police. So there's a chain of command, especially that gets kind of skewed and broken, and normally it ends up in some drastic episode, much like the Prude case, when protocol is not followed appropriately. So.
I'd like to talk a few minutes about the economics of the system, both within the state and nationally. The cost of maintaining people in correctional facilities, the cost of the drug war, or the causes of why so many people have been incarcerated. I think that escapes the attention of a lot of taxpayers who worry about the visible things that they see having money spent on them. But the thing about prisons is that unless you work in one or you have one in your community, you tend not to think about it very much. So Mary, what do we know about the fiscal situation with corrections in the state?
Well, we know that Rikers Island is conservatively $350,000 a year to maintain one person on Rikers Island. That is just a staggering amount of money, and it really begs the question. And again, it's the point you're making. The taxpayers aren't even aware of this, but it really begs the question: is how much would community support help? How much would that cost in terms of mitigating arrests, driving all of this up? So many people would not be arrested if they had proper community support. For example, I was on a panel recently with a man named Stanley Richards, who was formerly incarcerated and the head of the Fortune Society in New York. And he said that in New York City, they have these certain blocks called $1 million blocks, and virtually everyone on Rikers comes from one of those blocks in the city. And there aren't that many of them. They're in the poorest neighborhoods. They are typically people of color. And the question is, what if that 350,000, if that money was diverted to those blocks, those neighborhoods with quality drug treatment, childcare, affordable housing, all of these things to bolster that community would cost less than what we're paying to incarcerate these poor people on Rikers Island. So I really think that's the crux of it. What are we doing?
And I would add in that data set that not everybody at Rikers is in there for the first thing that went wrong in their lives. Many of them have come back as parole violators, and so they're and that's true in the state system as well. You miss an AA meeting, you're back in jail for 2 years. So there are people in the jails that are really there because of I would say inadequately resourced parole system, so that people are better managed and looked after when they get out the first time, so they don't make a U-turn and go back and re-enhance the prison population. Reverend Bell, please.
We've spent a lot of time in this area, and when I take a look at the formation of the prison population from the 13th Amendment, the clause that's in there that allows for the re-enslavement of people based upon due process, and so we have created industries that the profit motive was the primary issue, the issue of property and making sure that we can take care of that through slave labor even after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And so there has always been an unethical element that's been a part of prisons, regardless of what era we have seen, and whether we were talking about what happened under the Clinton administration or during the Reagan administration. All of those things happen. Now, Mary, you talked about having property community support, and I call that advocacy. What happens with many minorities is that you have a public defendant and that system is broken, period.
Oh, yes.
Period. And so the whole issue of due process at least presupposes that everyone is entitled to it, but no one ever asks about the quality. And the only excuse that public defenders would have is that they're overburdened with the number of cases. Now, they may have done something different down in New York City versus what they did in upstate New York a few years back, by lowering the number of cases that a public defender can have. But it still did not mean that we were not stacking Black people in these prisons, in these jails and prisons at unusual rates. And so what that did was traumatize communities, period. You had two problems. If I took a look at what happened in the Oklahoma situation with Black Wall Street, where people were not prosecuted, and I looked at the people who were prosecuted with bogus convictions without having good representation, the numbers had already been stacked against a group of people. Kendi talks about in his book, Stamped from the Beginning. This has just been a scheme to make sure that to help to build privatization at the expense of this subset of people. And I know, Mary, you talked about the eugenics movement. Carrie Buck case was probably the most famous case in the United States, and she was white. The problem is that she was alleged to not at least reach a certain mental or social emotional status. No proof, but we have a country that obviously has no respect for the poor and dispossessed.
Right.
And so unfortunately, she winds up paying a price, which means that we pay the price. Who pays the bill? So when I talked about 1.2 trillion, that's the cost of the judges, the DAs, the jails, the process, the cost that the families are paying, which are absolutely unusual, and to be separated from not only their families and the communities, but to have no advocacy, to be pushed in the abyss. And that's before they get to the hole. What a hostile arrangement.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I could say so much about what you just said, but I had to write a book about it, about the way that it's impossible for people without money and without connections in the larger society just become pawns in this whole thing. And it's certainly the whole thing about your day in court. It's all words, it's all quotes, it's not reality at all.
We're not running out of time yet, but we're getting about a 5 or 8 minute notice from management here. So I'd like to sort of introduce a final topic for discussion. And Mary, from Mary's book, I'd like to ask Mary, what can people do to help? What should people do, or listening to this and they're saying, this is a situation I need to apply my energy and creativity to? What are the things that society, individuals, religiously motivated people can do? Maybe first Mary and then Reverend Bell.
Okay, great question, Gordon. I just want to comment on something that just happened in New York State that's very, very good thing. I've been a part of a campaign to abolish solitary confinement. And I actually worked in the solitary confinement unit on Rikers, and I could never forget it. And after an 8-year grassroots campaign, of which the National Religious Campaign Against Torture was intimately involved, we got it passed in April, and it was unbelievable. It took years of advocacy in Albany, but we got the bill passed. So now in New York State, it will take 1 year to go into effect. Solitary confinement, no one can be held in solitary beyond 15 days, which is in alignment with the United Nations. It's a huge victory and the first state in the nation to legislate this. So with that being said, what's next? Parole. There's a lot going on. There's a campaign called RAPP, R-A-P-P. I would encourage people to Google it. They have all kinds of, again, grassroots activities around releasing aging people from prison and parole reform going on all over the state. It's upstate, downstate, and join in. Great people. You're going to meet some wonderful people, and it's another very, very worthwhile endeavor. So we've got to keep it moving. No more solitary. Let's reform parole and keep it moving. So that's something specific I'd suggest.
That's great. Over to you, Reverend.
You know, with me, I work on so many different ends of this. I think one of the biggest challenges we have right now is how to bring more people into the conversation, how to bring the public into the realization that laws that are passed without their knowledge and without their authority or permission is really an abuse of power. We operate with a representative form of governance, but just because we elect people, it does not mean that we have any more than virtual representation. And until we get to the point and the time where we create a system of gridlock where the community has voice in what is done, we will never be able to weed out the stuff that is bad until the community is able to have enough voice to say, hell no, we won't go. And I think that becomes a critical point of whether it's activism, whether it's about what needs to be shaped. That decision needs to be taken out of the hands of those in these small communities that are controlling and keeping those decisions away from the people.
That's well said. I think we're just about at the wrap up point here. I think my reflection on the information that our experts have shared this evening is that the system that we're talking about, which has criminal justice elements, has mental illness, facets, has issues of incarceration, parole, treatment, all of that. It's really the thumbprint of our society, and it's such a huge issue. It reflects all of the dysfunctions that we see around us, and they get into this vortex that ends up at a place like Rikers, Auburn, Elmira, and other facilities in New York. And our co-sponsor this evening, In Our Name, I think is a moniker for that very attribute, that all of this dysfunction that we observe and experience in the system is being done in our name, whether we participated in it or not. And because it's being done in our name, we have the greater obligation to get involved and take on one of these issues. The solitary issue is one that's very near and dear to me. One of the leaders of that organization, Johnny Perez, is a good friend and really dynamic individual who's making a national presence for himself on that issue of solitary. And he was in solitary at Rikers for quite a long time. Yes. Caffe, Lena, thank you very much for putting this on. I think this is a tremendous benefit to the community, to the audience that is participating. Caffe has a great tradition of staging entertainment that speaks to justice of all kinds. I remember, Utah Phillips, one of the great singers for justice. Arlo Guthrie's been in for the Caffe many times, as well as Pete Seeger. So there's a tradition here that we're upholding today. We're sort of standing on the shoulders of those individuals and our predecessors at the Caffe. I've been a patron of the Caffe for almost as long as it's existed. My wife even longer than that. And we really appreciate all of the good work that Sarah Craig and the Caffe board do to make this type of technical approach possible, to broaden out the audience, to hear the message from Mary Buser and Reverend Bell this evening. So with that, I think we will close it out unless Sarah Craig would like to come in and give us a benediction of some kind.
Unmute. Can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Okay, I don't see me. Okay, wait a second. There, we're gonna go. Reese is letting me start my video. So thank you very much for giving us your time. You know what I want to do? I know that you have this well of strength inside you that keeps you going through, the rare win and probably the frequent loss as you really reach for the stars to try and make things better for all of us, and especially for the most vulnerable people that you work with. And I always want to hear, before we sign off, what keeps you going? How do you keep from getting hopeless or cynical about these issues? How do you keep your hope alive? Reverend Bell, could you speak to that?
You know, in Southeast Asia, there's a bamboo tree that takes 9 months of watering before the seedling begins to break the ground. The farmer is tasked to, in good days and bad days, to continue watering that seed. And in 9 months, the seed begins to burst through the ground. Sometimes that bursting through the ground is passed on to the next generation, but it doesn't mean that that ground should not be watered. What keeps hope alive is the fact that there is a process that we're attached to. And I, as a person of faith, I do believe that God will have the last word. And as long as God has the last word, we have a very positive role to play as a community, as a healthy part of life, to push for that. And never forget that your labors are not in vain. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary.
Well, just had a moment to reflect on that. It's a very interesting question. And I don't know if I have a complete answer. I know that my experience on Rikers Island changed my life. I was never in any danger. I connected with people as human beings. I found it very rewarding, and I found it very tragic at the same time. And when I left there, I could not forget. I was determined to write about it, because I know that there are other people. If through my book if I could tell them, meet the people that I met, here's their predicament. Get rid of this bad people behind bars type of, it's just so, this whole black and white, good and bad, it just doesn't exist. But there's so much suffering as a result of that belief. And just this commitment to dismantling it, to illuminating my experiences, amplifying the voices. And that's what the book is about. You're going to hear all the voices, get to know all of these people. And that was my determination. And I always wondered if there would get to a point where I'd be say, okay, enough's enough. But I realize it's my life's work, and it's not going anywhere. And the more I do it, the more satisfied I feel, the more I have the opportunity to do things like this. It's just, yeah, there are days where, where I read, I'm like, oh, this is so awful, I can't take it anymore. But the next day I'm ready to go right back at it again. So who knows, but it's all good. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your tremendous strength, and Gordon, you too. You've given so much to the community, and I appreciate that. And to all of you who are out there watching this, please know that it's going to stay available on Caffe Lena's YouTube channel, as well as on Caffe Lena's Facebook page. And I would strongly encourage you to share it on your own channels and pages, so that we can get this message in front of more people. Again, thanks to our sponsors, and thanks to all of you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.